Hello everyone, Giltar here with a discussion point video. Now for this discussion, I would like to know what all of you guys think may be necessary for the healthy growth of future toy lines. And basically anything else that's related. So we could talk about model kit lines and all the related media like comic books, animation, live action movies, whatever. Uh, Now, just to expand upon this subject and give a little more clarification, because it is kind of vague, I'm going to share with you guys what brought this question to my mind. Now, I recently listened to a G.I. Joe podcast called What's on Joe Mind, and in this podcast episode, the podcasters interviewed a gentleman by the name of Kirk Bozigian, who is a former executive at Hasbro, and he was basically the original product manager behind the G.I. Joe 3 3/4 inch toy line in the early 80s. I believe it came out in 82, and he was largely responsible for its return to the toy industry. Previous to that, G.I. Joe existed in basically the 12-inch sort of action man figure format, and again, it was Mr. Bozigian who sort of revamped the idea of that brand, along obviously with the help of many others, but he was, again, the product manager, so he was largely responsible for its return, and not only return, but successful return to the toy industry. Now, Mr. Bozigian was asked what he would do with the G.I. Joe brand if he was in charge today, and he basically said, quote unquote, blow it up. He would retire the classic characters and bring in a new generation of characters for today's market. He basically said that, definitely he is also not only a previous, executive and manager of toy production and marketing, but he's also a toy enthusiast. He's a collector. He's someone who grew up with toys, loved toys, and that was the reason why, or partly the reason why, he entered the toy industry. And he understands that for diehard fans, for the collectors, for those people who have long-time nostalgic connections to established classic characters like Snake Eyes and Duke and whoever else, he can understand that people who have that connection are going to be upset with the concept of retiring classic characters. However, he also made a point that in the early 80s, the G.I. Joe sort of brand, the characters, the fiction, the sort of face of the characters were well suited to that era. In that era of, I guess, American culture and the public face of the military, you did see people who were in their late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s, and so the character designs and the character concepts reflected that. We had characters that came from the Vietnam War or the Korean War, entering the G.I. Joe concept in the early 1980s, and that made sense. However, for today, the children out here in the market who have exposure to the modern military, they see soldiers and veteran soldiers who are much younger. I mean, the public military face of various organizations these days are of men and women who are in their mid-20s and maybe even slightly younger. That's what kids are used to these days. So to look at a character like Duke from 1982, he looks like a guy who is in his early to mid-30s, and maybe it wouldn't resonate as much with a child of 2012, 2013, for example, as it would for a child who was around in 1982 or 1983. So I really agree with the idea that, for G.I. Joe to have some prosperous forward movement, we need to consider building from the ground up again. And this is a topic that is asked between fans and collectors in in areas such as G.I. Joe, Transformers, and other long-standing brands. They ask, what would you do to help this thing, this franchise, this brand that you're a fan of? What would you do, or what would your idea be to help this go forward? And often one of the common suggestions is to revamp everything. And the reason why people say that is because while they're fans, honestly, they've seen these characters time and again, and they would like to see new ground explored with brand new characters, with new backgrounds, new motivations, and basically a new depth to the stories connected to these, toy lines. Now, I personally have heard and read so many times people criticizing modern or newer takes or interpretations of classic characters. I've read and heard such criticisms so many times I can't even keep count anymore. Characters like Duke from G.I. Joe or Optimus Prime from Transformers. Uh, when you have long-standing, iconic, classic characters who have been established decades ago in terms of motivation, behavior, and all these other character attributes, when you try to do a new take with those characters, more often than not, you're sort of in a no-win situation. If you're too radical in reinterpreting the character, then people criticize you for being not writing the character like that character should be. Like, that's not Optimus Prime. Optimus Prime would not behave in that way, or something to those ideas or lines. Or on the other hand, if you're too slavish and too much of writing back and homaging the original concept, people will say, well, this character has been done time and again, it's stale, it's boring, let's see something new. So either way, when you're trying to work with an established character, there really is no way to please everyone, or at least not the majority. It's very difficult. So to avoid that, let's just create brand new characters. Let's retire and grandfather out the established characters in a way that they're not just simply dropped off and never mentioned again, but continue on in the universe and say, well, we're moving on. These characters were here before, but they're essentially retiring. They're not in active duty or whatever you want to say anymore, and then you move on with the next generation. Now that can be risky, but at the same time, everyone who started some sort of brand of fiction or things like toy lines where you have to create some sort of context behind the products, everyone had to start from scratch. They had to start from nothing and build up. And I think that's what we need now. Because right now, when we play around with established characters, we're basically restricting the toy designers, we're restricting the writers and concept people behind it with parameters that stifle, more often than not, rather than nurture the creative process. Because again, they have to, no matter what they do, they always have to harken back in some way to the original character. And that is so restrictive when you try to create something that is essentially new or newer. So that's my take on the situation. And again, I'm asking you guys, what do you think? What brands are you guys fans of? What do you think, if they need any forward progress or evolution, what do you think is necessary for those brands, whether it's G.I. Joe, Transformers, He-Man, whatever else you're into? It can be in other things too, Gundam, Kamen Rider, anything that you're fans of. I would love to hear your thoughts. As usual, I welcome text comments for responses as well as video responses. And I hope everyone takes part. So, as always, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for watching. Have a great day, and see you guys at the next video.